Well, good morning, church family. It is good to see you here. I just want to say thanks again to everybody that's helping serve, our students that are helping serve, both of our deacons that are serving this morning, as well as our elders, and all of you that are also volunteering both in our audiovisual and our worship team. Thank you guys so much. It's always such a blessing to have so many willing servants here as a part of our church family, and I'm so thankful for every one of you guys. And I'm glad that you're here today. We are currently in this preaching series here out of the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, and we're calling it Life Under the Sun. And the sun is S-O-N. And the reason we're calling it that, it's actually kind of amazing. The wise King Solomon, as he's kind of taking us through his journal, this book called Ecclesiastes, and he's talking about everything in such a kind of a melancholy kind of way. I mean, he's talking about life and all the pursuits in life as meaninglessness. And there's that word that we've been referring to over and over and over again, the Hebrew word hevel. He says it's all hevel. He says it over 30 times throughout the book. Life is so meaningless. It's hevel. It's a chasing after the wind. And he talks about all of these different empty pursuits that we sometimes go after in this life, this chasing after the wind, so to speak. It's life under the sun, not S-O-N, S-U-N. And with all of that, he still points to a better way to live. In spite of the meaninglessness, there's a more meaningful way that we can live, a life under God, under Jesus, not so much geographically, but authoritatively, and that's living your life under the S-O-N, under Jesus. Even though this book is probably written thousands of years before the birth of Christ, Solomon, in all of his wisdom, inspired by the Spirit of God, he is able to direct us and appoint us to a better way to live our life, a life that what we've been saying from the beginning, it's a kind of a life above the noise. It's a life above the meaninglessness, the mundaneness that life can sometimes throw at us. The unfulfilling pursuits in life, he's saying, okay, there's a way to live your life that brings ultimate fulfillment in your life. And it's a life under the Son of God. Now, I would ask this morning, if that's the kind of life you want, every single one of us, we'd say yes. That's the kind of life I want. I want a fulfilled, a meaningful life. And that's why I think this book of Ecclesiastes, this series, is so very important to us. It's the wisdom that we can gain, that we can glean from looking at Solomon's life, both from his successes, but mostly from his failures. And it's sort of like having to sit down with Grandpa. How many of you had a grandfather that you were close to growing up in life? I just want to see some hands here, okay? A few of you did. You had a grandfather that you were pretty close to, maybe your mom's side, maybe your dad's side. I knew both of my grandparents growing up, but I wasn't close to them. On my mother's side was a guy by the name of Milton, and he was kind of a very serious, a very stern, a very surly man. And most of my life, he lived, as a farmer, and most of my life, he lived sick. He had emphysema from smoking most of his life, and I think they probably said he had lung cancer there towards the end. And the time that I spent with him, it was mostly him telling me what to do and then fussing at me that I didn't do it exactly the way he wanted me to. And we weren't very close at all, I would say. He was a man of few words. And then on the other side of my family, on my dad's side, my other grandfather, his name was W.C. Wilson Caldwell. That's where I get my middle name, Wilson. And he also was a man of few words. He was known as a very shrewd businessman. He'd owned a business all of his life and ran the business and made some money. He was a penny pitcher. His reputation in our community was that. And again, I just wasn't very close to him. He was never very affectionate. In fact, neither one of my grandfathers were very affectionate men. I don't ever remember receiving a hug from either one of them. My one grandfather died when I was 10, the other one when I was 14 years old. And the truth is, the reason I tell you that is that I always wanted a close relationship with a grandpa. And so I kind of envy some of you that had that, and those of you that raised your hand. I always wanted that. I always wanted to be able to have a grandpa that's going to take me fishing, take me hunting, that would, have this kind of sit down, whether it's on the front porch, back porch, I don't care. And we would, crack some walnuts together, and we just kind of just sit and talk about life. I really didn't ask or want a whole lot more than that. I'd just be able to come over, and he wouldn't even ask me what I wanted to drink. Some of you had grandpas like that. He wouldn't even ask me what I wanted to drink. He'd just take a cup of coffee, and he'd sit it right there in front of me. I would know better, too, to not ask for anything in my coffee, because he would just look at me and be like, that's for wimps. Right? That kind of grandpa. We could just sit and talk. I'd soak in whatever kind of wisdom that he would give me, whatever I could learn from his life and his experiences in life. That's what I always wanted, but I never really got. But the reason I say that is because when we look here at the book of Ecclesiastes, and as we've been studying this, I hope you've been able to see that this is who King Solomon is. He's kind of like our grandpa here in the Bible. He's much wiser at this point in his life, in this journal, this letter that he's writing to us. It's almost as if he's sitting down with us as a grandpa, and he's like, okay, son, okay, daughter, okay, grandson, okay, granddaughter, I want you to listen to me. And the truth is, we do need to listen to him. That's what I've been trying to make a point from the very beginning, because the truth is, Solomon, he's literally done it all. He's literally had it all. He's had wealth, he's had power, he's had popularity. Whatever you're chasing right now in life, whatever that is, it doesn't matter what it is. Solomon's like, shh, step aside, rookie. Hold my beer, son. Watch this, right? That's who Solomon is. And that's what we've been reading into. Whether it's sex, fame, fortune, Solomon did everything. He had everything. The Bible says whatever his eye or his heart desired, he got. In fact, he goes on to say, you can do nothing on earth that won't be a repeat of something that I've already done. And however you did it, however they did it, it's a JV version compared to what I've done. But now, as we read this, he's kind of on the other side of all of that. He's much wiser now, much older. He's at the end of his life. And I want you to imagine this. He kind of picks up the phone, and he gives you a call, and he says, okay, sit down here. Let's talk. I want you to come over. I want you to visit with me. I want to be able to tell you a few things. You may not listen, but I still want to tell them to you. And so just imagine with me, okay, again, kind of put yourself in this scenario here. And you go over to King Solomon's mansion, right? And it's a mansion by far. It's only one of his many mansions. But you go over to his mansion, and it's right there with the beautiful garden. You've never seen a more beautiful garden than what he has. It's right next to that majestic lake and all those groves that he's been growing. And you meet him at this huge door. And he's there with a warm smile, and he gives you a handshake and a hug, and he invites you to come into his house. You look around at his house, and there's all these things because he's had everything, and it's got so much history. And you think to yourself, man, if these walls could talk. And he sits down. He puts a cup of coffee in front of you. And you just kind of sit there for a moment as you're just kind of waiting expectantly. And he starts to unpack some things that he's learned. And so if you got your Bibles with you this morning, I kind of want to go into it with this mindset, okay? Ecclesiastes chapter 7. We've covered these first 6 chapters, not in every detail that we could, because we could literally spend a year just unpacking, a few verses at a time here. But as we've been going through this series, we're now in chapter 7, and really this is kind of where we're going to camp out today. I'm not going to get to any other verses other than what we see here in chapter 7. And if you've missed any of the messages, you can always go online and get caught up. But Ecclesiastes chapter 7, you got a Bible. If you didn't bring one, there should be one in a chair around you underneath there. Or if you don't have a Bible, please grab one out in the gym, because we have some we give out each and every Sunday at our welcome table. But here's Grandpa sharing some wisdom with us. Verse 1, he says, "A good name is better than fine perfume." And I want to stop here for a second, because the funny thing about this is in the Hebrew, this is sort of a joke, as it were, because the word for name and the word for cologne or perfume, they're only one letter difference. And so it's kind of a play on words here a little bit. And the Hebrews that were reading this, they would know that. And so he kind of says this, he's like, listen, there are some things that you can do to make yourself more attractive in life. And we know this, right? I mean, if this were ever true in our day and age, as it were then in his day and age, I mean, just like today, I mean, you could do all kinds of things. You can buy colognes, you can buy perfumes, you can go get some kind of creams and rub them on your skin or on your face. You can go to the gym and get more fit, right? You can go and you can try to buy healthier food and eat better food. You can try to put makeup on. You can go get a tan, go lay out by the pool or next to at the beach. And you can do all of these things, right, to make yourself more desirable. And not just cosmetically, right? You can even do that in life by, go out and buying a brand new car or a better car, or you can buy the right kind of clothes. You can dress hipper. All these things, ointments, colognes, Grandfather Solomon sipping on his coffee, looking at us, and he says, who cares how you smell? If when your name is mentioned, everybody just seems to roll their eyes. Who cares how attractive, how beautiful you are? When people think of your name, is it synonymous with something you don't want it to be synonymous with? Grandpa, over a cup of coffee, leans in, he's like, listen, in the end, beauty is vain. Yeah, it's okay to want to look presentable, to tuck in your shirt, right? To want to fix your hair. It's okay to go get your teeth whitened. Yellow is not a good look, right? But in the end, you can do everything right externally, but as you get older, what people value the most is what's on the inside. And you think about that, man. Is that worth just the price of admission? Is that worth just coming and sitting down and listening? I mean, Solomon's like, it's about the heart. It's about your character. It's about a good name. That's what Solomon's trying to unpack for us. And he's kind of going like this. He says, why are you spending so much time on all the external things and you spend no time on what's on the inside, what really matters? Now, what Solomon says next, it's sort of shocking. And when I was studying, man, I was like, man, did I read that right? But listen to what he says, because I think we have to deal with it. He says, a good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death better than the day of birth. And so Grandfather Solomon here, he's like this guy, who has lived the life, right? He's lived the life. I mean, he's lived more deeper and done more things than any of us could ever dream of. And he's having a cup of coffee with us, and he's like, why don't we quit worrying about the external things on the outside so much? And why don't we start looking more on the things on the inside? And what if instead of trying to look the part all the time and trying to be somebody that we're not, what if we started actually playing the part and being who we really want to be? And then he kind of moves on, and it seems like this happens more times than not, especially as you have conversations with people like your grandpa or your grandma or people that have lived their lives, and now they're kind of looking at the back nine and they're just kind of reminiscing about life. And he starts talking about death. And he says, what's better than being born? Dying. And you think to yourself, okay, what'd you just say again? I mean, Grandpa, here we are soaking in this wisdom right now, getting all of this information from your experiences of life. And could you just repeat that one more time, what you just said? I think a lot of us, if we're having this conversation right now, we think to ourselves, okay, it's finally happened. Grandpa's lost his mind, right? Alzheimer's, dementia has set in. right? We're going to have to start looking for a home for grandma or grandpa right now. So that's, I mean, we think, man, he's lost it. Why is he talking like this? But I want you to hear this because it's so, I think, profound. I think Solomon, in all of his wisdom, he's got something to unpack for us. And we have to give it a chance here because I think what it means is revolutionary. You know, you think about it, birth, being born, it's all about potential. I think back to my sons when they were born, and it was amazing, really, because they were both born in different scenarios and different things going on at the time, but I immediately loved them both when they were born. It was really quite something. And I can't help but every single time I pray with them and we have conversations, I can't help but think about, you know, what God has created them for. I can't help but think about having a vision or a dream for their life. And I can't help but think about what it's going to be like as they get older. And I have all these hopes and dreams and aspirations for them. And at the end of the day, I really just want them to be, and many of you parents, grandparents, you know this, I want them to be everything that God has created them to be. I want them to experience everything that God has created them to experience. And so at birth, that's kind of how it is. When people are born, there's all this potential, but at death, and I want you to think about it from a believer standpoint, from if you're a follower of Jesus and what you believe about the Bible, from that standpoint, death is fulfillment. It's not about potential anymore. It's about fulfillment. It's the grace and the promises of God that we see in the Bible all coming together in this everlasting sort of package. It's this moment, right, where we think to ourselves, okay, all the things that Jesus said, all the things that Christ has for me, all the things that he's wanted of me, all the things that you know, this experience in this life has brought me to, all the things that I feel, this journey that I'm on, it's now coming to fulfillment, coming to completion. And that's what Solomon is saying here. And it's hard for us. Listen, I know it's hard for us. It's hard for us to get our minds around. And we're always so quick to dismiss things like death. We're always so quick to kind of get away from it as quick as we can, right? And we want to dismiss those things. And some of you are even thinking that even now. You know, you're looking at me and you're thinking, okay, Will, that's easy for you to say. You're 40, right? You probably still have another, 20, 30, 40 years ahead of you. And here's what I'll tell you, and some of you already know this, but my dad, he died when I was really young. I said, age of 12 and 14 years old, both my stepdad and my dad. My real dad was only 37 when he passed away. And the reason I say that isn't to get morbid, but it's just to be honest and say, the truth is we're not promised another moment, let alone tomorrow. And you may be thinking, well, man, that sounds negative, Will. Thanks for brightening my Sunday morning here. It's really pessimistic. But not according to what Solomon's saying here. It's not about being morbid. I mean, if you were to ask me, Will, don't you want to see things in life? Don't you want to experience more things in life? Don't you want to see your sons grow up? Don't you want to see Brody grow up and see his career, see his future, spouse? Do you want to see his family? And I mean, don't you want to be there when all of that stuff happens? Don't you want to enter that new season of life that parents, grandparents, that's a great season where your kids get older and your friendship gets closer in a way that you never thought possible? And don't you want to live into that experience of life and be that grandpa sitting with your son or your grandson or your granddaughter? And I mean, don't you want to have those kinds of experiences? Don't you want to sit, with your wife on the back porch, looking at a sunset or a sunrise, drinking some coffee? And the truth is, of course I do. I'd love to live to be 90, 100 years old. I'd love to sit on the back porch and do those things. But you know what the point that Solomon is trying to make here is that he's trying to say, you know what, all those things, truth be told, they don't belong to me. In fact, my family, my wife, my kids, they all belong to God before they ever belonged to me. And the truth is, everything that I have in this life, including life itself, it's all on loan to me. And anything else is really just idolatry. It's vanity. It's a chasing after the wind. It's hevel. And so Solomon's like, we have to change our view of death and how we think about death. And I love how one pastor put it. One pastor put it like this. He says, you want to know how blasphemous we sometimes are, how idolatry, kind of sinks in. He says, how about this? He says, on average, there are 400,000 flights that take off every single day, and no one hardly ever praises Jesus that they all land. Think about that. But you watch one airplane fall out of the sky and watch how people shake their fist at God. See, that's the same thing with death. So many in our society, in our culture, look at death as this enemy. And Solomon, again, grandfather Solomon here, sipping his coffee. This guy that has done all these things, he looks at us and he's like, death? No. Death is better even than birth. Death is the real beginning. It's the real adventure. I mean, could you imagine just sitting having this conversation? And then he kind of chuckles a little bit and he just keeps on talking. And so if you look in your Bible there, look at verse 2 because he's going to expound upon this even more. He says, it is better to go to the house of mourning than go to the house of feasting. For death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take heart. So Solomon he's talking about how death is the fulfillment of all that we were created for, all the things that God has in store for us. And then he kind of moves on. He says, on top of that, wise men, they walk into funerals not only to mourn, but they use those moments to look at their own lives and to have this introspective moment. And they pay attention to where they currently stand in life and in their relationship with God. And he's like, listen, I love the house of feasting as well. I mean, Solomon is the one to say this. I love to party. I've thrown hundreds and thousands of parties, the biggest parties you can imagine. I love being with friends. I love that moment where all the stars align and everything is good in life. But the truth is, it's not in those moments of life that you really think the deepest about life. No one's having this wonderful meal, this dinner, cutting into a steak and thinking to themselves, well, I wonder if everything's right between me and God. I wonder how things would play out if I were to die in this next minute. Nobody does that because we're so busy laughing and partying, listening to people tell exaggerated stories. So Solomon goes, no, the house of mourning, you see, it's actually better. And here's why, because it will make you think about some things that you need to think about that you don't like to think about. It says the wise man walks into a funeral, not only does he mourn, but he starts thinking about things. How do I want to be remembered? What's my legacy going to be? He begins to kind of take stock of his life. And so Solomon, again, you just kind of imagine grandfather Solomon sipping on his coffee. And he says, you know what? I've been to the best of parties, the greatest of parties. But it's the funerals. That's where I grew the most on the inside. Now, he's going to move on here, and the next couple verses are very similar to what we've already read, but it just kind of explains a little bit more of what he's saying here. In verse 3, he says, frustration is better than laughter because a sad face is good for the heart. Again, what Solomon says here, and it seems very counterintuitive at first as you read this, but he wants to stay on this idea of sorrow and grief and frustration and death being this place in which, we see our lives the clearest, right? You have clarity in life through these things in life. And you know this to be true, right? I mean, you think about your own life and the examples of your own life. I mean, isn't it in those times, like whenever there's grief or frustration and things in our life begin to boil up, right? Like if you are a very impatient person and then you go through a hard time, and then whatever that hard time is, right? And then you go through that, what usually boils to the surface? Your impatience, right? If you're an angry person and you go through a time of grief, what usually comes to the surface? Whatever that anger issue is. So whatever it is, difficulty, pain, disappointment, Solomon is saying here, listen, sometimes what we need to do is we need to quit railing against God. We need to quit shaking our fist at God when things get wrong, when things go wrong. And we might need to consider from a different perspective that it could be God in His mercy towards us bringing some things to the surface that we really need to deal with, that we really need to work on. I mean, think about it like this. It's a bad thing when the doctor just starts treating the pain, because at that point, he doesn't really get to the core to cure the disease. And so Solomon is going, the thing about sorrow is it just kind of churns up these things that sometimes we need to deal with in life. And we're forced to deal with in life. We're forced to bring healing in our life. And he's going to start doing this, and he's going to do it in a way where it's going to be like, okay, here's what the wise person does, here's what the fool does. In verse 4, here's what he says. He says, the heart of the wise is in the house of the mourning, but the heart of the fool is in the house of pleasure. Okay, and so Solomon's like, things like sorrow, grief, frustration, pain, anger, you fill in the blank, whatever those things are. God sometimes uses those things so that you can grow into the person that He's created you to be, to reveal issues, to bring to the surface things in our life that we need to deal with and do business with. And without those things, sometimes we never really get around to it. In fact, what we'd like to do is we'd like to bury them. We'd like to cover them up. We'd like to think that they won't resurface again. It's just forgotten about. Is it true that perhaps sometimes God brings about some things in our life just so that He can do what He needs to do in us? You may remember a few months ago I did this sermon called Heart Surgery. And what I brought up was the fact that sometimes God needs to do some things within our hearts so that it changes from the inside out how we live. And so that's kind of what Solomon's like here. He's like, look, you got a couple options here. You can head right into the house of mourning where God has you. And you can embrace those times. You can surround yourself with family and with friends, with people who are going to lift you up, who are going to pray for you, who are going to encourage you, right? Who are going to let God use them to minister to you. That's what the wise person does. They don't run from the house of mourning. They go into it. But he says this, he says, the heart of the fools, that they're in the house of pleasure. And you think about this. Here's what he just was saying. Sorrow, grief, pain, frustration, you name it. It's life, and it happens to all of us. Doesn't matter who you are. The wise, they surround themselves with people that are going to be helpful, the godly in their life, that are going to help walk them through it. They may not take it away, but they're going to walk them through it. They're going to encourage. However, it's the fool who immediately tries to hide it, and who sometimes tries to cover it up with pleasure. The fool, he says, is the one who self-medicates, who runs after whatever that temporary pleasure is, whatever that temporary fulfillment is, whatever that temporary drug is, right, that will mask or will numb or will make the pain go away, that will provide that temporary satisfaction and fulfillment. And let's cross the line here a little bit between Old Testament and New Testament, because this makes so much sense to some of the things that Jesus taught. And instead of running into Jesus and allowing Christ to operate and to break down and to work and to grow and to reveal and to move through whatever we need to move through in our hearts and in our lives with His help. Instead, what we do sometimes is we act foolish and we pretend, you know what? There's no pain. There's no suffering. Let's just numb that. Let's cover that up. Whatever vice that you struggle with, let's use that, right? And let's move ahead. Whatever addiction that you may be, into, let's just take that and run with it. Or whatever unhealthy habit. It doesn't have to be a vice or addiction. It could just be an unhealthy habit. You have pain, you have suffering, you have something like that go on in your life. Well, let me go eat something, right? Let me get something I can control because I can't control those things. Or let me go buy something. Or let me just soak all of those things in my work and let me just stay busy. Something's not right in me. Something's wrong. I don't feel right. Something's off. I feel something out of sync with God, but let me try to numb it. And He's like, instead of heading to the house of mourning, we head to the house of pleasure, hoping that will help. And most of you know this. In the end, it never does. It's only temporary if it does. And Grandpa Solomon, he takes a sip of his coffee and he says, it's foolish. If you're treating the pain and not the disease, the end is death. And listen to what he says next, and this may be the most difficult for us to hear. In verse 5 and 6, he says, it is better to heed the rebuke of a wise person than to listen to the song of fools. So much wisdom. And then he says, like the crackling of thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of fools. This too, he says, is meaningless. And you can imagine, Solomon, he takes one more sip of coffee. And he sets it down on the table in front of us. And he looks at us square in the eye. And he says this. You know what? Wise people, they don't laugh when they're on fire. They scream, I'm on fire. You know what a fool does, he says? A fool will sit there and he'll continue to burn alive. Shrugging it off, laughing even. People will come to him and say, hey, you're on fire. They'll shrug it off and be like, what? Come on, it's okay. It's not a big deal. I'm not hurting anybody. It's all going to work out in the end, right? How many of you have heard that or said that before? What's that smell? Oh, it's my flesh burning. You see, he says, wise people, they don't giggle when they're on fire. They scream at the top of their lungs. And it's this one, I think, more than anything else that Solomon, as grandpa here, who is, like I said, he's lived the kind of life that we probably will never even be able to dream of. And he's imparting this wisdom to us. And I can imagine he looks at us and he says this, listen, stop giggling while the world around you burns down. There are a lot of things in our life that are destructive to us. And we mentioned some vices and addictions and those kinds of things. But one of the things I think that Satan uses the most in our hearts and our lives? And it's something that we all struggle with. And it's pride. And the wise Solomon here is trying to get our defenses down so that we can be able to listen and pay attention to what he's saying. And I know some of you are thinking to yourself, well, I don't know that I struggle with pride. I don't know if that's me necessarily. I want you to follow me here because this is the crackling pot that's on fire, right? And he doesn't want us to miss this. Because this is what I see. I see so many marriages that are literally falling apart at the seams. And they could be saved early on. There is hope. Even throughout, there's hope, but especially early on. And there's this crackling pot, there's this fire, there's this smelling of smoke. And instead of one or both yelling, "Hey, there's a fire," people just so often let it go. And there's this coldness, there's this further drawing your hearts apart from one another until eventually the whole thing is just burned up. Maybe it's not marriage. Maybe it's a secret sin that you struggle with, that you don't want anyone to know about, that it creates these weird patterns in your life, and you feel like you have to cover up one thing and then the next and then another. Well, all the while, your life is literally burning down. And instead of yelling fire to someone who is close to you or to someone that can help, you just let it burn up. Solomon says the wise, they scream out, "I'm on fire." They don't laugh. They don't giggle. They don't pretend. They don't try to cover it up. You know what? This is also very true, and I think it's so prevalent in our day and age, especially when it comes to life and death and eternity, when it comes to people's hearts and whether or not they belong to Jesus, and whether or not you want to think this is in the church or outside the church, I don't know. I think it's in both. But it happens so many times where people are just living their life, and they don't really care necessarily about the consequences as long as they're not hurting anybody. And they don't want someone else to tell them what truth is. And they don't want to read the Bible. And they don't want to have someone as Lord over their life, such as Jesus. And they think to themselves, you know what? It's all going to work out in the end. And all the while, there's smoke, there's fire. And no one pays attention. And no one says anything. And here's the thing, right? I want to just kind of bring this home. This is where I think Jesus enters the story. And this is where I think Jesus is so very helpful to all of us. It's because here comes our Savior. Here comes our hero. And at one point in Jesus' life and ministry, he's asked, okay, Jesus, what's all this about? Well, why are you doing what you're doing? Well, what is the purpose behind all of this? Jesus, why is it, in Matthew chapter 9, he's even asked, he's like, Jesus, why is it that you go and eat at the house of tax collectors and sinners? What's that about, Jesus? And Jesus says, isn't the sick that need a doctor, not the healthy? I've come not for the righteous, but for sinners. It's the reason I'm here. It's why I do what I do. It's the reason I'm the Savior, the hero of this story. And I believe that if Jesus could tell us this morning, he would say very much the same thing. You know what? I've come for the burn victims. I've come for those whose life, whose marriages, whose relationships, whose worlds are literally on fire and they're burning down. I've come for you. I've come for those that feel like that there's no help and that the people around them, instead of pouring water on whatever it is that they're going through, all they do is throw gasoline on it. I've come for those lives who feel like they're exploding. I didn't come for those that are well. I've come for those that have been burnt. And here's the thing, church. You may be here this morning, and that may be you. You may have been burnt in your life. You may, as we've been talking, as Solomon has been pouring out this wisdom to us over coffee, right? You may be one thinking to yourself, you know what? But my world, my house is burning down. My marriage is on fire. My family my kids, their worlds are on fire. Am I the one who's screaming out, there's a fire? Am I doing anything about it? And listen, I know this is a tough message this morning. But the seriousness, the gravity of what Solomon is saying as our wise grandfather, we have to pay attention. We have to take heed of this. We have to hear, not just for ourselves, but as a community of faith, as a church. Because you know what I see so often, church? I see so many churches that do the same thing, that we're going through this world, in this culture that we live in this society that we're in, and the world around us is burning. What are we doing to help? Sometimes we get in our own little worlds and our own little bubbles, and we shut out everyone around us, the screams of those that are hurting. May we not be guilty of that as a church. May we give the only life raft that there is in this life, and that is Jesus. And may we give that to every single person on the planet as best as we possibly can, through every resource that we can. Jesus, he's come for those that are burning or have been burnt. What I want us to do here as we close this morning, I just want us to spend some time praying. And there may be different levels that this applies to you today. And what I want us to do is I just want us to spend some time with Jesus and allow him to speak these words of wisdom through Solomon into our hearts, and ask very candidly of ourselves, are we more concerned about the external than the internal? Are we more worried about what everyone sees in this world than the heart that matters the most to God? Are we at that point of looking at life and death and stopping trying to avoid the inevitable, but celebrate just what it means to have the fulfillment that we have in this life because of Jesus? And that when we die, we just get to spend all of eternity with him. Let's pray together. God, I just thank you so